Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Today on the show, we are going to be digging into a bit of a fun topic. I don't know what it is yet, but the request that I sent to our producer, Natalia Emmons, who looks at these and sources them ahead of time, I asked her, hey, let's do one that's a little bit different than the last few. Let's do one that's a little bit, that's going to push me a little out of my comfort zone. And Natalia said, oh, don't worry, because we have plenty of those that we can go through. That's right. We're going to be looking at a fantasy writing prompt. This specifically is a request for advice. And as usual, I have not looked at it ahead of time. I don't know what the topic is yet. So I'm going to read it live on air, and we're going to go through it together. But real quick, I do want to celebrate for those of you who watch the show on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much for helping us reach 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel, John Negroni, which is super cool to see. I think we started with like not hardly any. So to see that we've grown it up to 1,000, small milestone comparatively, sure. But for our little niche world, I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all the support and comments and stuff. It's really cool to see. And that doesn't count all of our podcast subscribers. Those of you who listen to the show, you also have been subscribing like crazy. And we've been getting such cool numbers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all that stuff. So thank you so much. Without further ado, let's get into things. Okay. We are going to open up our prompt here from Natalia, and I assume it's going to be a good one. Okay, so this comes to us from username Muted, and the headline is Writing Slow Burn Fantasy Romance. Oh boy, I asked for this, didn't I? Okay, real quick, I will say we did do a whole episode about fantasy romance, and I think it was specifically sort of about how to go about fantasy romance kind of in the macro. So that might be a good episode to refer back to as well, in addition to this one, especially because this is going to be dialing in a little bit more on a specific type of fantasy romance, which I love. Okay. So Muted writes, hello everyone. I'm currently working on my first slow burn romance, and I'd really love some tips on how to make it engaging without letting it feel boring or unnecessarily dragged out. I want to build tension and connection over time, but I also don't want readers to feel like I'm stalling just to stretch the plot. Boy, I relate with this so much. I hate when I'm the reader in this scenario and I'm like, oh my gosh, just kiss. Anyway, Muted continues to write, my story is a fantasy with werewolves, witches, and layered subplots running in the background. The romance is central, but not the only thing happening. A bit more about the setup. In book one, my male protagonist is bitten by an alpha, which completely shifts the course of his life. He meets the female lead, who has a mysterious past she keeps well guarded. They share a brief but intriguing connection, and then go their separate ways, for now. I'm planning to truly develop their relationship starting in book two, slowly building emotional tension and chemistry. So far, it's more about subtle glances, reluctant alliances, and hints of something deeper. I'd love to hear from writers and readers who enjoy or write slow burns. How do you pace it without losing momentum? What kinds of interactions help keep the tension alive? Any do's or don'ts to avoid the dreaded dragging feeling? Thanks in advance. I'd really appreciate any insights. All right, awesome. I love two things about this prompt in general. I love. And so keep this in mind if you ever want to write into the show, fantasy writing for barbarians at gmail.com, if you want your advice to be featured on the show. But one thing I really love about this, two things I really love about this. Muted listed out the questions for us, which is really helpful. Thank you. So I'll be able to go through each question. Love, love, love that they gave us a lot of context for the setup. This is definitely going to help me kind of put this in my brain and be able to give feedback that's a little bit more relevant. So well done. That is a great way to engage the fantasy writing community, not just in this subreddit, fantasy writers, but also for those of us who kind of sneak in and do these videos, podcast things. But okay, let's go through this. I'm excited. I definitely love talking about slow burn romance because that's my preferred way of writing romance. I think that, first of all, romantasy is the big thing that's selling these days, right? A lot of publishers, editors, literary agents are requesting manuscripts that do romantasy. But romantasy is a very, very different thing from fantasy romance. Fantasy romance typically, and I'm going to be doing a very oversimplified explanation here, but typically romantasy is more of a genre in the sense that the romance of the fantasy is really one of the central focuses of the whole story. Whereas more of a fantasy romance, which you'll see more commonly in more classics and things like that, it's usually just one type of character interaction that's part of the plot, but it doesn't really drive the plot as much. And a lot of the marketing too for the book doesn't really focus much on the romance stuff. It focuses more on the big plot stuff in the fantasy. The romance is all kind of just in service to that. Whereas romantasy, the romance is really part of the story. The tropes like enemies to lovers, friends to lovers, that kind of thing is used heavily in the marketing because it's way more present on the page. So while romantasy does tend to have some slow burn romances, those are totally, they exist. There are romantasies that do that. It's not as common. Typically in fantasy romance, you will find more slow burn stuff. Wheel of Time is pretty good about this. There's lots of lot of slow burn romances in Wheel of Time, mainly because it's just such a, at least at first, kind of like wholesome when it comes to its romance. It's really coy, I think is a better way to put it about the romance. And you really want to make sure that you're not too coy because sometimes that slow burn, it's not worth it. And so we'll go through all of these things. And I also use, again, Wheel of Time as an example of when I don't like slow burn romance because I don't like it when romance, I mean, if it takes like 7 books to get to the stuff, then that's going to be frustrating. But anyway, so I want to start with this. Like, how do you pace it without losing momentum? And I think the first thing I would mention here is that I will say, after reviewing lots of manuscripts in the past, looking at people's short stories, sometimes I think slow burn can be improperly synonymized, not synonymized, but thought to be synonymous with the plot being slow. So, put more simply, slow burn does not mean a slow plot. That's really important. And I think that can in very many ways be like the paradox of the slow burn. You assume then that the romance is slow and the story, maybe needs to be slow to accommodate that. But that should never be the case. The key to doing the slow burn is not to delay the payoff. It's actually redirecting the payoff. So think of it like alchemy. And I think of alchemy especially now because replaying Oblivion Remaster, alchemy is like my thing in that game. And I love the alchemy stuff because it's such an easy way to make money. And I love collecting all the ingredients and making all the potions. It's me coded. But with alchemy, the reaction of what you're creating is already happening, even if the explosion comes later. Think of it like you are brewing something that there's stuff happening when you do the alchemy. Like you're mixing the potions, things are happening, it's creating something. But whatever you're using that potion for later, whether it's healing you or you're throwing the potion at somebody as a bomb, whatever it is, that should not be the only payoff, is essentially what I'm trying to say. And I guess I don't mean to invoke Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood again, because that is an anime that I never finished. And I'll bring it up just because I know Bridget Surdock, our wonderful producer, is such a big fan and typically gets it right when it comes to Full Metal Alchemist. But my understanding is that the romance for that one is supposed to be slow burn. I've heard good things about it in that sense. An anime that I'm more partial to, not fantasy, but Love is War, Kaguya-sama. Love is War, probably my favorite anime ever. And that is the definition of a slow burn romance. And they nailed it in both the manga and the anime in terms of when it pays off. But you'll notice in Love is War, the setup is it's like these two high schoolers who go to war with each other because they like each other and they know the other person likes the other person, but they will do whatever it takes to get the other person to admit and confess their feelings first. And that's what makes it a war. And it turns into this just beautiful love story, even though they just cannot admit to each other that they like each other. And it takes forever. However, the way it is paced out does not mean the story is slow. The story is always fast paced. There are always these amazing, wonderful other characters that come in who just like make the story too. It's not just focused on this romance as one piece of it. Cannot recommend Love is War enough. I think that in some other fantasies, I would go back to Wheel of Time as well. Sometimes it's just like through the little moments that the writer Robert Jordan was able to sneak in, the little comments that they would make. The romance typically isn't like center stage in every chapter, right? But you can kind of just tell it's there. The chemistry is there. the presence of these characters kind of it just enriches everything else that's happening. The way that they react to danger and how they might think of the other person very briefly, the way that there might be a small significant gesture that the writer puts on the page, all these things kind of build up. Even the way characters might argue. I'm thinking specifically of Rand and Avienda, what they notice about each other, how they communicate with each other. There are all kinds of little things there. And that to me is what makes a slow burn romance really work, because the plot is moving, but the romance is struggling to keep up. And you're feeling that tension as the reader. You just have to make sure you nail the payoff, right? Howl's Moving Castle would be another good example of this, I think, where Sophie and Howl, they spend a lot of the movie kind of at odds, right? Or they spend it like apart, essentially. But we still feel the romance of it all evolving, because their relationship is baked into all the different choices they're making. How to Train Your Dragon 2 was kind of like this, even though both of the characters were already together. That is Astrid and Hiccup. There still was like the slow burn of their relationship evolving together, not just romantically, but them becoming like lifelong partners. And even though they spend much of that movie apart, there are little gestures, little things that happen where she like braids Hiccup's hair at the very beginning of the movie, and it stays that way the entire movie. And that's just like one tiny thing that just reminds you that even when they're apart, that they are thinking of each other, that they have these like little memories of each other that are driving them through all these separate kinds of situations. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing when done effectively. So I would say, yeah, each time your characters in your story are interacting, you got to make sure that the tension is always changing. It's not always a one note kind of tension. You have to escalate that tension in a way that makes sense and matches the story you're telling. You have to make sure that even if you're taking a step backward with the relationship, with the connection, that it still counts as momentum, because it's going to deepen the complexity of their relationship. Because taking a step backward, it's like the all is lost moment that happens in the story, where it's like, oh, they break up, or oh, they're never going to get together. But it's still momentum because it's all kind of progressing toward the same end, if that makes sense. I think another tip here too, in terms of like, because the other question was what kinds of interactions help keep the tension alive, and so I think that that's really important. I would say that you want to make sure that the desire between the characters is the subtext, right? Not the dialogue. I think that this is one of the best lessons I ever got from one of my writing professors, English writing professors in college. I remember him talking about how desire is not solely what a character wants. It's what they won't admit that they want. So, in other words, we're talking about the engine of a slow burn. Great example, The Witcher. Geralt and Yennefer, I almost call him Gerald. I always do that. Geralt and Yennefer, they're not constantly confessing their feelings to one another, right? The tension is in what they don't say to each other, what they're unwilling to say. It's in the choices that they make, who they decide to save, what they decide to sacrifice, who they decide to spend time with, specifically with Geralt and Triss. And then also when they're talking to each other, like in a book, the books and the games, the show not quite as familiar with, but I think I only watched the first season and a half of the second season. But there are just all these moments where they decide to choose silence, and that tells you so much. That's a type of interaction that keeps the tension alive, even though they're not saying anything, right? So when it comes to subtext, the subtext being the meaning outside of the text, the meaning behind the actions, the nonverbal stuff. You want the characters to have agency in denying their feelings, because every time that they make that choice to walk away or to lie to the other person or to protect the other person for, whatever reason, that is tension, right? That's going to drive the relationship forward, at least in some way. And it gets the reader invested, because it makes, again, it deepens that complexity of like, this isn't just like a straightforward kind of romance where everything can be happy go lucky and all that. So this is where typically I like to fuel my stories, because I only really write slow burn. I don't write, I mean, in short stories, I've done not slow burn, but like full on romance stuff. And I enjoy it quite a bit, sure. But I would say that when I'm writing a novel, I really like to up the slow burn. I really like to just, to the point where I'll have beta readers be like, are these two like, do they have a crush? And then I'm like, just read another chapter. And like, sometimes I take that as like criticism. Like, I want it to be more obvious, but I don't want it to be so obvious, because I want the reader, it's so fun as the reader to pick up on chemistry without the book telling you outright, without the book being like, and then I saw him, his jaw was carved and chiseled off of the Greek god of war, whatever it is. But I want it to just feel a little bit more of like, I can't believe he would say that. Why would he say that to me? Did not expect him to say that. And it frustrates me so much because I don't know what to say back to him. That is a feeling of like, wow, you're thinking about this guy a lot, aren't you? Maybe a little bit more than you probably would admit, huh? So like, that's the kind of stuff that makes a slow burn of the subtext. They're like, why are you reacting that way? When he tells you that you can't, get to the top of the mountain faster than him, whatever it is. And I will say that we could do a whole thing about this too, in terms of, when you're doing hetero romance, queer romance. I typically write queer romance because I don't know, something about hetero romance. I don't know if I'm as good at it, but whatever. I definitely find myself a little bit more fascinated by the dynamics of queer relationships in terms of how that can manifest in a fantasy story in a way that's just a bit more different than the stuff that I grew up on. But that's a whole other topic, probably for a whole other day. Other than that, I would say that in terms of like that question, like the interactions, I'd say that emotional intimacy is always going to be more important to me as both a writer and reader than physical closeness. This is something that is going to be different for everybody. Sometimes people will say like, yeah, emotional intimacy builds through the physical closeness. But, I think that that's not always the case. I think a lot of slow burns can collapse under their own weight when they mistake sexual tension for romantic depth. And yeah, I mean, like, we all do love a good steamy scene. I shouldn't say we all love steamy scenes, but a lot of people do. A lot of the people who like seek this out when they run a romance novel of some sort. But I don't think that the tension can or should just come from that heat all by itself. And honestly, the heat is made so much better by the emotional stuff too. And I know I'm coming off as like a total demisexual right now, but that's absolutely the case for a lot of people. I think even people who, sure, they could do a one night stand in their real lives, but I think that a lot of those same folks would also say that, like, yeah, but ultimately the emotional stuff plus the physical closeness is really what creates the holistic intimacy for a lot of people. And remember, you are writing books that should be read by lots of different types of people. You're not going to please everyone, but you do want it to be true to what you think. And if it is a more niche thing, that's totally valid too. But just, of course, prepping you for what most readers are probably going to be hoping for and expecting in case that's of interest to you. But yeah, and I think that in terms of like, okay, well, how do I, the physical stuff, sure, but how, and the emotional intimacy, how do I build upon that? Well, I think your number one word is going to be vulnerability. Vulnerability breeds emotional intimacy. Like, let the two characters see each other at their weakest. Let them see and observe their scars, physical and metaphorical, right? Not just and not just the physical stuff, but the emotional stuff, the emotional wounds, right? The things that really build the trauma of the character and their backstory. If you've listened to other episodes of this show or watched it, I've talked about this before, where one of the key things of building out a character is examining their wound, the thing that really sets up why they're here and how they interact with the world today, all that stuff. And yeah, let the in the present, let the characters see each other break down. Let them see each other at their weakest in a moment of vulnerability, in a moment of lowness. Like, that's a really crucial thing to bring two characters together. And let them hear, the way that their voice, which was so confident before, suddenly is like maybe coughing a little bit or like a little bit weaker, and they're starting to see a different side of that person. Particularly maybe when she's starting to talk about her past and she sounds a little bit different. This isn't what I expected. How do you think Beauty and the Beast works? Like, that is such an example of a short movie that, man, the Disney movie I'm specifically citing here, but how quickly, right? It's not even quickly, but the way that we go from this place where Belle and the Beast despise each other to suddenly they are in love. Like, how did that happen? And why did that magic trick work for so many people? Examine that. It's a lot of this stuff we're talking about. The characters kind of seeing each other at their weakest, starting to see another side of them, letting each other be each other's safe space at a certain point in the story, right? So, and then eventually they'll become each other's escape, right? So you have to start from a place where I feel safe around you. Now I feel like I can go forth to another new place with you. So that is kind of the building blocks that you're going for. So another good example of this, if you are more if you want a more fantasy example, would probably be the Greenbone Saga. That's Fonda Lee's set of novels. And those characters have really deep, complicated, multi book relationships that unfold alongside the world building in interesting ways. Their connections deepen through all the political stuff, the power plays, and a lot of the pain, And the books don't necessarily need a lot of pillow talk to make that happen, which I really respect. Not that it's a bad thing. I'm not putting down pillow talk, mind you, but there are other ways to do it, I guess is all I'm trying to say. The last thing I'll say before we get into do's and don'ts, because they did say any do's or don'ts to avoid the dreaded dragging feeling. Just one final point on the interactions and the momentum. I'd say that you need to give the romance some kind of narrative function. This is really important. I have to tell writers this all the time. This is your secret sauce, narrative function, because the romance has to do something for the story. It really does that. And specifically, the romance has to do something for the story that nothing else can do, right? Or almost nothing else can do. Don't make the romance a subplot that floats alongside the main plot like a balloon, it's just kind of like there, right? And it's just flow, you need to tie that balloon to your world. You need to tie that romance to your world, to your stakes, because here's a good example. People know Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? Zuko and Mei, that is actually a very important romance. It's a slow burn. It is a slow burn, even though they do get together rather quickly. There is, first of all, some foreshadowing that they're going to get together in the second season, but then also it's slow burn in the sense of them becoming like a legitimate couple. And I'm not referencing the comics or anything like that because that complicates all this stuff. However, anyway, the way that their relationship deepens and evolves, not just from like kind of dating each other to actually being in a committed relationship, that is an example of a slow burn. And it literally reflects Zuko's actual transformation. That's what makes that romance so important to the plot. It tells us something about who Zuko is becoming when we watch him developing real and long-lasting feelings for Mei. It's actually really it's one of the most underrated things too about book 3, I think, because people kind of look at that romance as kind of just there, but it's actually such a great romance in terms of how you can kind of chart the way that romance develops in real time, kind of starting from this like flitting thing where they're just kind of all over each other, but like clearly Zuko's dealing with some stuff, right? And the way that their relationship really culminates is, of course, when Mei decides to save him from Azula. Spoilers, I guess. But like that whole thing is where that slow burn romance that I was referencing before explodes. The alchemy explodes, right? You had the potions, you had them kind of like simmering in the stew, and then it just blows off. Or I don't know how to say that correctly in a way that doesn't sound weird, but hopefully you get what I'm saying. So in that case, you have to ask yourself when you're putting this together, like, how does this romance that I'm crafting, how does it interfere with or enhance the fantasy plot, right? How could they, for example, betray each other? How do they have maybe conflicting loyalties? Fantasy's rife with that kind of thing of like, oh, this person's from this army, this person's from this army, Romeo and Juliet time. How do their different powers, in terms of like werewolves and stuff like that? I think it was werewolves and vampires, right? I think that's what Muted said. Make sure I didn't. Yeah, werewolves, witches, not vampires. Sorry, werewolves and witches. Totally different factions, right? How do their powers, their types of powers, their personalities mixed with those powers, how do they cancel each other out? Or how do they combine in a way that's even more terrifying, right? Really examine the way that those powers really impact how they're built as characters. And then from there, develop that into what their romance can mean for their powers and all that. So that essentially is what's going to make a slow burn matter. Give the slow burn romance a narrative function. It's very important. All right, and the last thing they said was any do's or don'ts to avoid the dreaded dragging feeling. So for do let them fight each other. Not just physically, right? Like arguing. And you could do a physical fight if it matches your story and you're doing it tastefully. But lovers who never clash just are not as interesting. They are just wish fulfillment. And sometimes that works. I have written versions of this that do work, where one of my most recent books, and Bridget Stardock will attest to this, there are two relationships that are going on. One of them is that kind of clash where they're arguing and they hate each other, but they love each other, blah, blah, blah. But then kind of alongside that is the healthy like relationship that starts developing, and it doesn't have that as much, but they still clash. They still have a kind of battle of wits, but it's treated much differently. And my whole point in that is that I wanted to show the kind of like toxic version of how a relationship can start and the healthy version. And even the healthy version is going to have clashing, but it is not just, yeah, it is not just wish fulfillment. It's not just, oh, this perfect person came along. It's, oh, here's a person who challenges me in a way that feels productive and feels like I can rely on this person, even if I don't always see eye to eye with them. And that was my goal in that. And yeah, I please, please, please let your characters clash, but it doesn't just have to be these like big emotional blowups that don't make sense, where they just have, fight for the sake of fighting. Also, let your characters, I'm still in the do's, do let the characters grow separately, even when they're apart, right? Two characters orbiting each other grow a lot more potent if their arcs remain distinct, right? So this is something I struggle with sometimes, for sure. Remembering that, like, yeah, every character, especially the love interest, needs an arc. I went into that on the whole fantasy romance episode previously, but each character has to have their own kind of like, what are they getting out of the story, in terms of like, this character, they're trying to come to terms with, maybe their past and how that interacts with their present and future. This other character feels like they're being pigeonholed by society and people underestimate them. Specifically, the romance I'm talking about is one of the characters, she's always being overestimated by the world around her. Everybody thinks she's this amazing, unstoppable badass. And then the other character, her love interest, she's kind of like, everybody underestimates me. They think that just because like I mix potions and stuff, that I can't, stand up for what's right. I can't, be counted on to do these amazing things. And so because they have these distinct arcs, you're able to kind of more readily buy that they see something in the other person that attracts them very quickly. So that's just one example, though. I'd also say that you want to make sure you're paying off every beat that you're setting up. This is so important. If the characters hold hands in chapter 8, right, make it mean something by chapter 20. You can't just get kind of like, and then they held hands 2 seconds longer in chapter 11. And then they said that, you want the beats to kind of have that rising action like any story does. They're holding hands in chapter 8. They should be smooching at a certain point. They don't have to be, but you know what I'm saying? Like, there has to be some kind of escalation that's done tastefully. So in terms of don'ts, I would say, please do not tease moments and never follow through with them. This is related to the beats thing. Like, you can delay, for sure. Delaying is fine, but you should not evade the tension. You should not evade the moments that you're setting up. And another don't, I would say, is like, don't replace chemistry with convenience, right? So if they're only together because the plot says so, like, readers are going to notice that. They're going to be like, okay, yeah, like this feels very convenient, feels very contrived, honestly. Want them to You want the chemistry to feel like the characters are really resisting it. And even if the character wasn't there, they were like separated for whatever reason by the plot, that chemistry would still burn without them. Yeah. And then lastly, I'd say do not stall for the sake of stalling. I kind of mentioned this before, but I got to reiterate it. Every single delay should have some kind of emotional reason. And if you do decide to go with that, there's a whole thing in the book that I just wrote where there's a big kind of like denouement, like the characters get split up and it stalls the romance, but it wasn't for the sake of stalling. It was because this character needs to be alone. This character needs space. This character needs to go through something on their own and sort out their emotions without the other person being around them, because that's only going to solidify their feelings. It's only going to make them, or force them to be like, all right, when it's just me in my head and I don't have anybody to talk to, what's going to happen up here in my head? So that was that was the whole gist of it. So anyway, to the writer of this prompt, Muted, I think you're on the right track. I think that you've got some cool lore going on here. I think you have your stakes kind of figured out for the most part. It sounds like you really care about doing this, not just slowly, but doing it well, which I really am happy to see. And for that, I'd say you're already winning in certain cases. So I think your job now is like, don't let the romance simmer in some kind of vacuum, honestly. Let it ripple outward and let it complicate everything. Don't be afraid to do that. And because in a good slow burn, the world starts to change right before the characters do. That's one of the hallmarks of fantasy. And when the characters do finally touch or smooch or tell the other person, I love you so much, that should not be the end of the fire between them. That should only be the ignition. It's only the beginning. So that's my final little piece of advice there. So thank you so much for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I do have a couple of comments from our wonderful producer, Bridget Surdock, because Natalia decided to send the prompt to Bridget. So I want to go through that as well so we can get Bridget's take on things. So here's what Bridget had to say. And again, reading this for the first time, let's see. John is very good at slow burn romance. Aw, thanks, Bridget Surdock, always being nice to me even when I do not deserve it at all. But very good at slow burn romance, especially in a fantasy setting. Me, not so much. I don't often have the patience for it as a reader or a writer, but exceptions have been made. And that, I mean, I think that Bridget's underselling it a little bit, or overselling that. I think Bridget very much has been very good about, telling me like, please make these characters get together, but they're not like annoying about it. So Bridget said, anyway, here are my thoughts. First and foremost, if the romance is the central plot, but you don't plan on actually building the relationship beyond subtle glances, reluctant alliances, and hints of something deeper until book 2, I don't know how to tell you this, but the romance isn't the central plot, and that's okay. You can still do a slow burn romance without it being the main part of your novel, or in this case, series. Yeah, and I think Bridget's probably referring to, like, especially if a book tries to market itself as romantasy and it's doing that, that's gonna anger a lot of people, because they're gonna be like, well, hold on, there's no romance, or like the romance is too suggestive. So yeah, you have to be careful with that sometimes, especially when you're trying to balance your intentions with how the reader's expectations, right? Bridget also said, without knowing anything about the plot, you need to figure out why the characters might be resistant to the romance. Is it the other person? Is it the larger conflicts in their world? Is it a past trauma? Some other thing I didn't think of just now, or maybe even a combination therein. And once you find that, find what it will take for them to look past that, to decide that the thing stopping them doesn't matter as much as the romance. Yeah, that's a great compliment to what I was saying about, yeah, the characters seeing each other at their weakest. They learn about the trauma, right? And then they're able to kind of, to what Bridget is saying, like, what makes them look past all that stuff? Well, in many cases, it can be that vulnerability that we're talking about here. So great compliment to my point for sure. Bridget also put, slow burn romances don't always mean things aren't happening between the characters. I once read a slow burn romance where the two main characters were sleeping with each other the whole time, and then 20 something chapters in finally admitted to liking each other. The tension came from an imbalance of power, fear about the relationship being common knowledge, fear over it becoming real, and even reluctance to admitting that their friends were right, that maybe they just needed to get laid. You could bring tension to any relationship, no matter the level of physical attraction or activity. Yeah, and that's exactly what I was hoping to communicate with like Zuko and Mei. Like, yes, technically they were like in a relationship. They were literally like dating each other, but they were still the slow burn, right? And then also Love is War Kaguya-sama. It's like, clearly the characters are in love with each other. Like, that's not in question, but it's a different way to do slow burn, where it's like, yeah, they just kind of need to admit how they feel with each other. A lot of teen comedies do this for sure, in terms of like, they sleep together in the beginning, but then the movie's sort of about how they get together. Yeah, all that. My personal favorite slow burn romances are where the romance is forestalled because of the larger plot, i.e., the Hunger Games, Crier's War. This is how you lose the Time War. I think that's because my biggest complaint with most slow burn romances is that they can easily be solved with proper communication. But if the world, the plot, the conflict doesn't want it, it's much more realistic, I think. Yeah, and I would say that the danger can be, though, what I was saying toward the end, which is that you want to make sure that they're not getting together out of convenience. That whole thing of like, the plot wants them together, so they're together. And so Bridget here is saying the opposite, right? You want the plot to work against the relationship. You want it to feel like the whole world is against this relationship happening. Beauty and the Beast again, right? And Hunger Games, totally great example. Like, one of the, like, it doesn't matter if the characters properly communicate. This is not the time. They have so many other things that they have to sift through, and those emotions are too deep and complicated by a single conversation to solve it, right? And there are also reasons why, like, Peeta doesn't want to tell Katniss how he really feels. Of course he doesn't. Like, they just went through like such a traumatic experience, and I mean, it's so complicated. It's like, does he really love her? Is it just for the show of the Hunger Games themselves? Like, I'm sure he has all these conflicting things going on in his mind. Of course, it's not just something that could easily be solved in a conversation. So there you go. Bridget said, I'm still stuck on this romance being central, despite the fact that the two romantic leads apparently only meet briefly and then part ways. I don't see how that can be central at all, even if in book 2 it becomes more important. I know if I picked up a book marketed as a slow burn romance and the romance doesn't really happen, I'd be upset, even if book 2 was out and I knew that it would pick up in the sequel. Yeah, so Bridget did read the prompt ahead of me, and this is a good point. I didn't really bring this up, and I think that is a good case. I think it depends on how Muted handles this as a central romance, of like, maybe like, again, it's clear that they are developing feelings, or they even go on a date or something like that, but the romance still isn't paying off. It could be something as simple as that, where there is still progression, right? As long as there's progression and you feel like the progression makes sense, then you can get away with this. But yeah, this is a valid criticism from Bridget Surdock. Well done. Bridget wrote, without knowing the plot or why the two romantic leads have a reluctant alliance or anything, it's hard to give any specific interactions or anything to help maintain tension. That's what I did. I got a little big for my britches. The only thing I can offer is forcing them to trust each other, which is not the same as showing them slowly trusting each other over time. Force them to give trust to this other person who they have no reason to believe deserves it, and then have it pay off. The characters will inevitably become closer, but it will still feel wrong in a way, because the trust wasn't earned properly. It worked out this time, but who's to say it will next time? They had that alliance. Of course it worked out that time. And I will say, Walking Dead, weirdly, is such a good example of this, because Walking Dead, so many of those characters, the only reason they trust each other is out of like these people land in each other's lives, and like it works out because like, oh, they saved me. They could have easily killed me and I didn't trust them before, but we're in this zombie apocalypse. I decided to trust them. Next thing I know, we're a found family. And it still feels wrong. And the story is kind of about that at the same time. The story is also kind of questioning that at times. You know, should you give up everything, even your own flesh and blood, to like make sure this person is protected and all that? And yeah, that's actually one of the rare cases. I will say Walking Dead is a good example of how to do something well. Sorry, I'm being a little mean there, but Bridget said, this next one's mean. Oh, Bridget's going to be mean too. This next one's mean. It doesn't have to go in the episode, but I got to say it. I'm sure it'll be fine. Reading the word alpha makes me unreasonably annoyed every time because either this is an Omegaverse novel, if it is, to say it with your chest, or you don't understand what an alpha really is. Alpha was a term coined by L.D. Mech, an American biologist who studied wolves specifically. He published a study using the term alpha wolf, and the word latched onto it so hard he spent decades debunking it, proving that the alpha wolf was nothing more than the parents of a group of wolves. They were in charge not because they were more aggressive or powerful or some other nonsense. They were in charge because they were the parents, full stop. I would say this is a valid thing to bring up, Bridget. And I would say to Muted, you're probably going to be fine because most people don't know this. But at the same time, I'd say that you have an opportunity then to maybe bring that into the story, bring in that idea of like questioning and deconstructing the concept of an alpha to what Bridget is saying. That could actually be a really cool, unique thing for you to do that could make your werewolf story stand out, actually. The characters kind of go in with these presuppositions about what an alpha is, and the story can deconstruct that and actually do something really thoughtful with it. There are probably other werewolf stories that have done this that I'm just not aware of, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. So there you go. All right. Well, thank you, producer Bridget. That was wonderful. So glad we were able to bring your stuff into this as well, because Bridget has awesome fact-based opinions. We should call this Bridget's Fact Corner, even though it's opinions, but opinions boosted by facts. We'll say it that way. All right, but that'll do it for today's episode of Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Thanks so much for listening to the show. We have a Discord, the In Between Drafts Discord. Check it out if you want to join our little community there. We are talking about writing and all that fun stuff, but also other things in between drafts like movies, TV, games, music, and more. And of course, if you have your own questions, something that you want to ask me about for show purposes, like if you want something featured on the show, whatever, if you have advice, something you want to lay out, our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. I'd love to get an email from you. But of course, you can always comment too on the episodes, and we'll try to get to them for follow-ups to these topics if we can. So that'll do it for now. Be sure to keep on, talking too fast. Be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.